It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Phil. This is the show about all the stuff going on at the University of Louisville that, for the most part, does not involve athletics. We talk about the academic side, the research, and all the good stuff the students are doing at the University of Louisville. So what have we got on the show today? Well, companies who provide health insurance are spending more on their employees who are obese. But are those workers being discriminated against and not getting raises because they are obese? We'll talk to an economics professor about his study and whether employer-based health insurance causes discrimination in the labor market. We'll also talk with researchers who looked at the families of LGBT individuals who tried to commit suicide. How did those families play a role, good and bad, in those LGBT individuals' lives? But first, it's a growing debate with expensive, overcrowded prisons. What should we do with prisoners who are terminally ill? Stephanie Prost is an assistant professor in the Kent School of Social Work, and she's here to talk about the study that she's been doing and working on with prisoners who are terminally ill. Stephanie, good to see you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Well, tell us a little bit about this research you've been doing on prisoners who are terminally ill.
Right. So we started actually with a content analysis, and that's head up by a colleague of mine. She's a PhD candidate at Florida State. And it was essentially trying to get at what are the key elements of compassionate release policies kind of across the country. And compassionate release is sort of one of the two broad options for folks who are terminally ill behind bars. You can either stay on site and receive services there in the prison, or sometimes you can go home based on kind of what the state allows. So we started with that content analysis, and what we essentially found was that there's so much variability between states. Some states have really explicit guidelines, very transparent, very clear as to what you are able to do when you leave, if there are fines associated with supervision. And then we also found some states that were very draconian. And so there were elements there that really put kind of a burden on the individual upon release that made it very challenging to have a continuum of care that met their needs. So we are actually working now with support from the Kentucky Department of Corrections to kind of take a look as to what the needs of the older adults are here in the state. And so older adults and terminal illness go hand in hand, but they're not sort of necessarily the same thing. So you can have terminal illness but be under the age of 55. So that's where we've studied now in the Commonwealth.
Well, at any given time, how many inmates does the state of Kentucky have in its various prisons that are considered terminally ill and are going to die within, a couple of years?
Right, that's a great question, and hopefully we'll.
Or you don't know the answer yet?
Right?
Is that one of the
sure.
things you're looking at?
So we are we're doing that in a couple of ways. We're going to paint this portrait by not only doing surveys with folks who are incarcerated, but also by taking a look at medical records and criminal records side by side in an effort to kind of take a look at this comprehensive, again, glimpse. So what are they saying is going on? What does their disability look like? What kind of chronic and terminal illnesses are they facing? Medications they're taking, things like that. But then also, what did the medical records say as well? And that will provide us a better understanding as to how many people this affects here in Kentucky.
We're talking with Stephanie Prost from the Kent School of Social Work. We're talking about her research into prisoners who have terminal illnesses. Now, I know that I think it's at Luther Luckett Prison up in Oldham County. Isn't there a medical facility in there where you have a bunch of really old guys that are in prison but are being treated with cancer and other illnesses, right?
Absolutely. So right now, the most comprehensive medical unit's actually at the State Reformatory, also in Oldham County, just across the street.
So that's LaGrange, okay.
Right, exactly. So there's actually kind of a hub there. There's several institutions. But Kentucky State Reformatory currently has the largest density of folks with those chronic and terminal illnesses, and they actually have some pretty comprehensive care models, like you mentioned. They've got their own medical units. They've got skilled nursing supports. They have really wonderful peer support available, men, that are providing support to other incarcerated individuals who are also incarcerated. They're doing a lot of, again, pretty intensive work out there.
So what's the dilemma then for the state of Kentucky and for other states? What's the problem? You got a guy that committed a murder or a sexual offense or whatever. He's been committed to life in prison or 40 years or whatever, and he's dying in prison. Well, a lot of folks would say, well, okay, he's got to serve out a sentence. If he dies in prison, he dies in prison. But there are others who say, well, look at how much money we're spending on this guy, and it's not very humanitarian of us to just let him rot in prison, right?
Right. I think you hit both of the major themes there. So you've got kind of this push and pull between what's going on in the community and what our state lawmakers have to say about people serving their time, right? There's a lack of judicial discretion. Sometimes people have to serve a certain length of their sentence before they're even eligible for parole. But then you also have the victim's perspective, folks who've been wounded physically, emotionally, fiscally even, by these men and women who are incarcerated, and thus they want to see that they kind of fill their entire term. And then the other side of that, of course, is maybe the fiscal considerations. What are we putting into the men and women who are incarcerated with these conditions, and how much is it costing taxpayers? And so there's also kind of a middle ground there too. Like, what does it say about our personality as a community? Are we geared toward restorative justice? Do we see value in serving time and having our consequences met, but also having an opportunity to return home?
So does Kentucky have early parole for folks that have terminal illnesses and then are in prison?
Yes, we do. So right now, 46 of 50 states have some sort of compassionate release and or medical parole on the books. It looks, again, different between each state. And so one of the things that we're hopeful to do at the end of this project is to have a better idea as to what the folks look like, so as to provide some recommendations as to how that policy might shift, so as to not only meet the needs of the department, again, their primary mission is safety and security, right? Not necessarily healthcare. So we want to be able to make sure that their needs are being met as an agency, while also assuring that the individual is receiving the support that they need.
Talking with Stephanie Prost from the Kent School of Social Work at the University of Louisville. And you said one of the things you're trying to figure out at the end of this is basically what kind of inmate you're looking at here. So what kind of inmate are you looking at here? Are you looking at folks who are generally going to die within 6 months and got terminal cancer, or are you got folks that, they may die in the next 5 or 6 years, and we don't really know when they're going to pass away?
Right. So we're interviewing older adults, and in Department of Corrections nationwide, that actually means people who are about 45 or older, and that can be pretty shocking, I think, to hear. There's kind of some pre-incarceration and carceral setting factors that lead people to age much faster than they do maybe in the community. So they might look like me or you, our parents, our brothers and sisters, and so their conditions might be terminal. They might have a prognosis that's going to maybe be limited to a year or so. But a lot of folks are facing just numerous complex medical conditions. So they have chronic issues such as high blood pressure, liver disease, emphysema, COPD. Again, our state has the highest rate of cancer in the country, and that's true in our correctional settings as well. And so we have that going on, and then it's compounded by the stress of living in a correctional environment. So cortisol production can reduce immunity. And then you also have just acute infectious conditions like MRSA and strep.
Mm-hmm. So these conditions that these folks have, would it mean, in general, from what you've seen, and you go into these medical units, would it necessarily mean that even if they got out, they couldn't go commit a sex crime? They may be wheelchair bound, no way to, they're in such bad shape that they just can't get out. Is that one of the considerations when considering early parole for these folks?
Right, and that's probably the most important, I think, is that we as a community and as advocates for the justice involved, we want to see that there's a low risk of reoffense to assure that we're not only supporting men and women who are going to be safe and get the level of care that they need, but also that they don't necessarily pose a risk to others. And so one of the things that we're doing in our study here in the Commonwealth is to follow the recidivism over the next 5 years. So if an individual is in fact released, did they reoffend? If they did reoffend, was it the same type of offense? Was it a technical violation, or was it this brand new crime? And so hopefully that will tell us within, we'll have year one, but once 5 years are over, we can say comprehensively that over the 5-year rate, we didn't see a ton of recidivism among these older adults. And so that would support the initiative to get people out sooner and to get them the care they need.
Do states, including Kentucky, have delineate the difference between if a prisoner is in for committing murder, for instance, versus writing a bunch of bad checks,
right,
and they're facing a terminal illness and deciding whether they can be paroled or not? In other words, do they bar parole for sex offenders, armed robbers, murderers, those kinds of things?
So that's a great question. So the content analysis that we did kind of speak to the sentencing requirements. There are some states that require just a certain percentage is served. There are certain states that also require that there's a minimum amount of time remaining, or maximum amount of time remaining, so you can't go out if you have 15 years left. The same is true for those the charges. If it's a sexually violent offense, there's a lot of restrictions. Oftentimes you're not eligible at all. The same is true for higher level felony crimes as well.
And what do you hope to have come out of this, say a year or two from now, when you wrap up some of this research or get farther down the road on this research? What do you hope to have for the Department of Corrections and state legislators and others?
So we want to have evidence to quell the anxiety of the community. And because we don't really know, it's not fair for us to say that the rate of reoffense is or is not lower. We need to be able to have data to support that. Additionally, again, being able to have institutional level portraits to tell KSR what is it that they're facing. Of course, they have access to medical records, but how does that necessarily align with self-reported disability? How easy can you get in and out of your bed? Can you transfer in and out of your wheelchair on your own? Having that institutional level data will also help them to identify needs for programming and services that are supportive. We at the Kent School are also hopeful to propose interventions related to harnessing those peer supports. There's a lot of really supportive evidence nationwide that these peers, men and women who care for other men and women who are also incarcerated, are an incredible strength to these units.
Workers who are obese cost their employers more money for health insurance coverage, right? And presumably those companies, rightly or wrongly, punish those obese employees with lower wages or fewer promotions, right? Well, we're going to find out from Conor Lennon, who's an assistant professor of economics in the UofL College of Business and has studied this issue. Conor, good to see you.
Thanks for
Welcome
having me
to the show. All right, so you heard the setup there.
Yeah, you certainly.
Did I get right to the point?
There's not much more else for me to say. I think we're done.
Well, but I didn't answer the questions about obesity. It's,
well, the way you said the right, it's very rhetorical. So
Okay,
it's
okay.
do those questions even need to be answered?
all right. Well, let's start from the top.
Sure.
You took a look at obesity and employer health insurance. What'd you find?
Yeah, so this is one research paper in a sort of a larger body of work on the sort of empirical regularities of what happens to people's wages when health insurance is offered and not offered, and particularly to groups of workers such as older workers versus younger workers, males versus females, and in this paper, obese workers and non-obese workers. And when I actually started looking into this, what I found was while obesity is a large driver of healthcare costs in the United States, the CDC estimates something like $150 billion a year, which is over $1,500 per person, and certainly more than that for adults. But what I found when I looked at the data and I looked at people who are working, who are able to work full time, in that age group, they're not really the ones driving the costs. For obese men, the difference in medical spending is somewhere between $600 and $700 a year, and for females, somewhere between $1,000 and $1,100 a year.
Compared to what?
Compared to the $1,500 on average for the entire population. So they're much lower. And so what I was expecting to find when I looked at this data is a very small wage offset. And that's what we mean by in economics, that these people would sort of face slightly lower wages, but not a huge amount. Why? Because, well, if your employer is on the hook for that kind of extra spending, and I can talk a little bit in a moment about how that spending works its way through to your employer, they're going to be able to write some of that off against taxes. The employee themselves is going to have to pay some of that in the form of coinsurance, deductibles, and copays. And so the employer is going to be shielded from a lot of those expenses.
So the bottom line is the company that has some obese workers is not penalizing those obese workers by giving them a little bit lower wages.
Just very slightly, right?
Okay.
And that's sort of the test that we want to see. We want to see that sort of if we want things to be fair, we don't want obese workers to be over-penalized nor under-penalized for how their medical expenses affect the rest of us, right? And the way this works is employer-based health insurance. Your employer basically is charged the cost of what it costs to insure your group of workers. And so the premiums they pay they rise and fall with the medical expenditures of the group of workers at that particular business.
So if you've got older workers,
for sure,
that smoke,
yep,
and drink a lot, and I don't know what else, and eat unhealthy, I don't know how you regulate that. But if you got a bunch of smokers who are older, your health insurance costs are going to be higher.
Right.
So I guess the question is, do those workers get penalized? Have other studies shown that if you smoke, you're penalized with lower wages,
Correct.
and if you're older, you're perhaps penalized for not making as much as a younger counterpart who saves the employer money on their health insurance?
Yeah, basically what you're describing is the incentive that this system creates. It incentivizes employers to kind of seek out, if they have two people who can do the same job, it incentivizes them to try and cherry pick, to pick the worker who's going to add less to the medical spending and add less to the health insurance. And economists are very interested in this because the employer-based system of health insurance in the United States is very unique in the world. And so it's extremely unusual. And employers are economists are very interested in how employers manage that, especially in today's environment where the medical costs of treating various conditions are just skyrocketing, especially since 20 years ago, right? So 20 years ago, this wasn't a big deal. Nobody's
Right.
medical spending was that serious except for people with life-threatening illnesses, and that's random, right? It's not,
Right.
it sort of strikes anybody at any time, and it doesn't really discriminate. But when things get more and more expensive, the cost of obesity for any given number of obese people is now much more expensive than it was in the past. The cost of smoking is much more expensive than it was in the past. And so employers are becoming, the research in economics has shown that employers are becoming much more sensitive to this. And so this paper is one of a couple that I've got on the same topic looking at this.
Economists in general say the market is what should drive the forces of economics, okay? What decisions a business should make. I think what you're saying is that there are other factors here that are becoming more and more a factor in what businesses decide to do with their employees and other things. I mean, if health insurance is costing them money, they're taking a harder and harder look at that. So as a nation, if you're an economist, what would you say we should do? Should we just leave it alone, let the businesses decide who to hire, who not to hire, who to give a break to, and who not to give a break to, based perhaps on their health? Or should we, if you're really going into political talk here, but should we go to a single payer system where everybody's the same?
So I don't think I'm in a position to
kind of put you on the spot,
decide
didn't I?
these kind of things. But what you see is employers trying to deal with this problem using, insurance plans that have higher deductibles, where more of the risk and more of the sort of incentives are pushed back onto the employee to try and manage their health. They give discounts on the monthly payment towards the insurance that the employee pays if you will complete a health survey or if you do this or that. And they have, employee wellness programs. They have gyms at work. They're trying to manage the costs in a way that allows them to continue to offer health coverage. But in time, if this becomes too serious, they're going to just drop the health coverage, right? And then we have to have the discussion about, okay, where do people insure themselves against risk? Because the concern, the problem that employer-based coverage solves is, hey, if I want to go get health insurance from I go to Humana and I say, hey, I'd like some health insurance. Well, they're going to say, why are you coming looking for health insurance now? What is wrong with you? And so they're going to make you go through a battery of tests. And basically, they only want to give health coverage to healthy workers. Just like now, the employers want to only hire the healthy workers. It's the same incentive at play. But in the past, at least having the employer-based system managed to get us around that problem. Whereas, if you were looking for insurance directly, they're going to make you do a medical exam and all that kind of thing. So this is a problem that's sort of being kicked down the road, right? Kick it down to someone else's problem. And
you think
who
it'll be
knows
a
what's gonna
problem?
happen?
You think it'll be a problem in the future?
Unless the cost of medical procedures falls dramatically, or stops rising at least, we're going to face a serious problem where the vast majority of what it costs an employer to hire you is coming from the benefits that you get, not the cash that they pay you in your monthly salary.
What happens when an LGBT individual tries to commit suicide? What did they go through? What did their families go through? How did they provide support? Well, Sara Williams and Laura Frey are both with the Kent School of Social Work, and they have done a study on this. So welcome, ladies. Good to see you.
Thank you for having us.
All right, let's do a little bit background on your study. Tell us a little bit about this research that you've done on these attempted suicides.
Absolutely. I'll let Sarah take the lead on that. She, as a doctoral student, she actually took the lead on this study of coming up with the idea, looking at the interviews, and really making sense of it.
Okay.
So I'll let her describe a little bit about what she did.
So what did you find out about these survivors?
Well, we analyzed interviews from a project called Live Through This, and we looked at just the basic experiences of what suicide attempt survivors had gone through. And the prompt of the interview was basically just tell me your story. So it was very broad, and so we just read through those and analyzed them. And we found mostly really 5 main findings, and those were the intersection of identities, the identity concealment piece,
So what is that? I don't know what any of that means. So, and let's back up and be clear. You looked at sexual minorities, right? This was a very specific
Yes,
study.
we looked at gender and sexual minority suicide attempt survivors. So it's a very specific sample.
Okay, so then go ahead. You said the top two things. What were those things? What did they mean?
Intersecting identities. So they talked a lot about the different components of their identity that impacted their experience. So their sexual or gender identity, racial identity, religious identity, and those different types of things that have impacted their experience and their story.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll add on that also, seeing how those two things conflict in some ways. So they both can bring their own level of stigmatization, and whenever you see those types of factors compound on top of each other, it can create even more cause for concern.
So was this a self-worth kind of thing, or they were embarrassed about their identities, or what? I guess that's my question. What are you talking about here in terms of the way they were feeling about themselves?
Sure. So whenever you, someone who's feeling suicidal, oftentimes they already feel isolated. They feel like a burden to those around them. They feel like they don't belong. And so that can also be compounded after an attempt occurs. So after someone's attempted, they can feel like they let their family down. Their family can be giving that message, or they can have a message from the community that they were selfish, that what they did was wrong. And really that's a message that's misunderstood. They shouldn't be given that message. But whenever you have multiple identities that can be stigmatized in that way, that level of isolation, of burdensomeness can be even stronger. And so that's why we wanted to look at this population and see how can we step in as clinicians to make their recovery better.
Got it. We're talking with Frey and Sara Williams, both from the Kent School of Social Work. And so what else did you find, Sarah? What were some of the other factors on why these particular folks that were LGBT or sexual minority, religious minorities, others, decided to try and take their life? And then after they didn't, how did they get to the recovery stage?
Family and family dynamics were discussed a lot by all of our participants in the sense that negative family reactions and family conflict kind of contributed to their desire to die.
So like if they came out as gay and their families rejected them, that played a big role?
Yes.
A big role with a lot of them, or just a small role with a lot of them?
Kind of both,
Okay.
but
Depends on the person.
Depends on the person, I guess.
But
yeah.
that disclosure piece is really important because if they came out to their family and got a really negative reaction, that would increase the internalized stigma that they felt. But then it also would decrease the chances that they might go to that same family member to talk about suicide if they were experiencing that. And so that really cuts out a very important intervention point for us to be able to prevent that suicidal behavior from happening.
Because you might be able to have the family member come forward and say, hey, Fred over here is, I think he's suicidal or working on, and would come to a therapist like perhaps one of you, right? Yeah. What else did you find in the study that jumped out at you?
One of the more unique things, I think, was the prevalence of discussion about chosen families, which is uniquely utilized within the gender and sexually diverse populations as members of communities who might be friends that are then that person's family, especially when there's a detachment or estrangement from the family of origin. So a lot of our participants discussed how important that chosen family was in their recovery and in preventing future suicidal behavior. So that was a really important thing, I think, that came out was that chosen family piece.
So these folks often feel self-hate, isolation, those kinds of things. That's why they try to commit suicide. Is that a fair assessment or not?
So it could be a multitude of different factors. Sometimes it is that isolation piece. For each individual in the study, their reason for feeling suicidal was unique to them. For what we were really looking at was how did they experience being a gender and sexual minority as well as an attempt survivor, and how did that impact it moving forward? Who did they go to for support? And I'll add one other really important finding was the importance of peer support. So someone who not only was also a gender and sexual minority, but also was an attempt survivor, to understand how those two things can connect and limit maybe who's available, who you feel safe going to whenever you're struggling with suicide. So that level of peer support was really important.
And did most of them have someone that they had found after they tried to commit suicide that said, oh yeah, I'm a friend, and yeah, I either thought about suicide or I tried to commit suicide too, and here's what I went through and here's what I did? Did most of them have someone that they could go to that had a shared experience as them?
So no, actually.
Really?
A few did have a peer support to go to, but they all seem to talk about the importance of peer support, how they wish that they had somebody
wish
to
they
go
had
to.
it, okay.
And also, so part of these interviews came from a project called Live Through This, which is an advocacy project interviewing attempt survivors. And so some of them were also participating in this project to be able to put their story out there, to be a form of peer support for other people in need.
We're talking with Laura Frey, who's an assistant professor in the Kent School, and Sara Williams, who's a doctoral student in the Kent School of Social Work. And why is it important, do you think, that you do these kinds of studies and you look at these folks that did try to commit suicide, and then what happened afterwards?
It's super important just because a lot of times these people don't get to share their stories, and especially in the broader communities and within academia, sometimes suicide attempt survivors' voices aren't represented, and that's really the best way that we can understand what is actually going on and how we can best help people. And so doing this kind of qualitative work that amplifies the voices of people who often get left out of research, I think is the best way to kind of move the field forward.
Yeah, Laura, you're shaking your head, yes?
Absolutely, yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think also it's easy sometimes whenever we're talking about a group of people with a shared experience to lump them all together, and really hearing these individual stories tells you can pick out some commonalities, but you also see the uniqueness. And so by looking at all suicide attempt survivors, that's one thing, but whenever we narrow it down and say specifically for gender and sexual minority attempt survivors, we see some unique needs for intervention, some unique resources that potentially we as a prevention community could offer and to try to improve their experience.
What's the message to those of us who are friends of LGBTQ individuals, or those of us who are heterosexual and may not be going through the same thing that they're going through? What's the message to us out of this study?
Well, I think there's a lot of takeaways. I think understanding the way that multiple stigmatized identities can compound one another and make it even worse, that it's not just stigma against suicide, it's stigma against not understanding LGBTQ individuals, not understanding, there's lots of miscommunication out there and misconceptions. So I think, especially whether it's a suicidal individual or someone who's LGBTQ, I think something that you can do as a supportive person is even just staying open to hear their story and say what's happening for you, not making assumptions about what's going on, but saying how can I help?
Mm-hmm. And Sara, is that the nuts and bolts? I mean, I think those of us in this room have gay and lesbian friends. Is it easy for us to talk about, what are you feeling? The deep feelings of those folks is tough unless you're very, very close to them. So what should we do? I mean, we can be supportive, obviously, but what should we do?
I think the most important thing is to be there and make it known that you're there, even if it's not something that you necessarily be super comfortable doing, just to make it known to those people in your life that you are there and that you are there to support them. And taking any opportunity we have as privileged members of society to kind of stand up for people who are in gender and sexually diverse populations or people who are in marginalized populations.
Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.